Hey adventurers, so today is going to be another book review. This is going to be for Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right because I don't speak French, but I'm going to call it Les Mis for the rest of the book if I ever refer to the title again. So this is historical fiction, I think. It's kind of hard to, a definition of historical fiction is kind of difficult, but it's French literature, it is history, there's some historical aspects tied into it, and it's fiction, so sure, I'm going to call it historical fiction. It's about rebellion, it's about romance, it's a classic, it's very much a classic of literature. So this book by Victor Hugo is considered one of the masterpieces of French literature, of classics, and of so much more. This is a much loved story and to many daunting in its length. In years past, I've watched adaptations of this story, but it has been so long that I really don't remember much about the story other than a few random scenes. I thought I had some idea of the story, just based on how prominent and well known it is in our culture, but it turns out I really didn't know that much at all about it, which I find to be the case more often than not with classics. I mean, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, no idea what was going on in those books until I read them. Around the World in 80 Days, The Time Machine, even Oliver Twist, stuff like that. I've read so many classics this year, and most of them I had no idea about the actual story before I went into them, and that was just amazing to me. And I actually love reading stories that way, where I don't know anything about them. This book is kind of too grand in many ways, too broad, too big to quickly sum up. The characters' journeys are too complex, but this story was wonderful. It was filled with rich detail and interesting characters. Jean Valjean is a great protagonist, and while the book deals with far more than just him, he is at the center of the story, but he's surrounded by characters, each with their own stories just as complex as he is. Thénardier, though in many ways the villain, and seemingly the most one-dimensional of the characters, is kind of there to interconnect everything from Jean Valjean to Marius and just so many other characters. Fantine and Cosette also are tied to Thénardier's character to some degree. Just kind of everybody ties in, I mean everybody obviously ties into Jean Valjean, but then again they're interconnected even more because of Thénardier. Javert is, though not the villain, he is the antagonist. It's kind of an interesting thing that Victor Hugo did, where Thénardier was the villain and Javert is the antagonist, and they're not the same character. So though he's far from the villain or a bad guy, he's the one that I was the most interested in aside from Jean Valjean. Fantine and Cosette fulfill in some ways pretty much the same role to some degree, but at different times in the story. So kind of Fantine is the first half of the story, and then Cosette is the second half of the story type thing. Not exactly, but kind of, sort of. And they kind of fulfill that same role to Jean Valjean, in that it's somebody that he kind of is trying to protect and take care of in a way. And then there's Marius, who is another character who comes into the story later in the story, but he's one that doesn't have an easy life either. None of the characters in this book have an easy life, you could say, but Marius doesn't have an easy life. He tries really hard, and he holds to his principles and to his decisions. He made a decision earlier in the book, and he pretty much refuses to go back on that decision because, you'd say, honor or hubris or whatever you want to call it, but he made a decision and he's sticking to that decision, and I kind of appreciate that as well, even though there is an out for him, it's that he didn't take. But there's so many more characters than just these few who play important roles and who interact and are dragged into this story due to the other characters. Javert's family, or not Javert's family, Thénardier's family, and then I don't remember what the young boy's name is, and then Marius's friends and all these other characters that are brought into the story and play important roles in the story. There's so many of them that I can't just go through and give a little bit about each of these characters like I did with these 5 here. I find myself thinking back to scenes in this book constantly, maybe not every day or anything like that, but relatively often I start thinking about parts of Les Mis. Not to mention how I see influences in other books or find moments or characters that remind me of Les Mis. Specifically, there's a character in Collation Song by Andrew D. Meredith that I messaged Andrew and was like, this character reminds me of Javert, And then I was also reading through Oliver Twist, and I messaged Kate and I was like, what is this? And I wrote down a scene and I was like, what is this from? I can't remember. Is it Les Mis? And she's like, yeah, it's Les Mis. And so there's things that I notice in other books or see references to or see influences of from that all come from Les Mis, and it's understandable because this book is hugely important to literature. As great as this book is, though, this is one of the only books I've ever read where I can look at it and say, yes, this could and probably should be abridged. As interesting and well written as it is absolutely overwritten. Pages and pages of detail that really do not affect the story at all. Some that set the scene for a moment that is important to the story, and some that just add more information for the sake of adding more information, or probably for the sake of having a higher word count. So there's absolutely a lot in this book. I think the first chapter is one that I read it and I was like, how is this going to tie into anything? And it does tie in, but you could cut it in half. You could significantly condense that chapter. There's other chapters. The history of Thénardier is one that you could basically cut down to the last couple of moments of it and still get everything that you need out of that chapter. The detailedness of the sewers, it's absolutely unnecessary for telling the story. You could basically cut out that section and just continue on, and it wouldn't affect the story at all in any way, shape, or form. And so there's a whole lot of stuff like that all throughout the book where I'm seeing it and I'm like, this for the story, to tell the story, it does not need to be here, or it could be condensed significantly. All that being said, though, it is incredible. It's extremely immersive, and even as a translated work, it has an incredible amount of humor and wit and skill shown in the writing. Overall, just a fantastic story and a fantastic book, and I'm very glad that I read it. I did do it on audio, which is really good because it would take me forever to get through it physically, but it was a great book, and I definitely do recommend it. At this point in the year, I don't think I will read another book that tops it, and it will probably be my top book of the year. There's a handful of others. I have maybe 5 books at the moment that I could put in the top 3 slots. This one I think is probably going to be in the number 1 slot. It's not one that I'll reread incessantly, though. It's one that every several years I might reread, but it's not one that I'll just reread year after year. There's too much there. It's great, but it's too much. So that is my review for Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Les Mis by Victor Hugo, and thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday and have our social medias linked in the description down below. We will see you guys again soon. Stay well.